broadcasting.
Good day, everyone. My name is Paul Carroll, and I am the new director of the Charity and Security Network. I'm thrilled to be with you today and thank everyone for joining. Today, we have three very expert panelists who we are thrilled to have with us, and they're going to help us understand the web and the complex system of licensing that is under the Office of Financial Assets Control, as well as the Bureau of Industry and Security regulations within the Department of Commerce. Many of you in the field, many of you listening in on this call have run up against confusion, the difficulty of obtaining such licenses to be able to do the good work you do. So we're hoping that in the next hour, you'll be educated, given some good guidance and information, general information about these processes. I want to make a general statement, a disclaimer. All three of our panelists are practicing attorneys. None of the information or the comments in this conversation today should be taken or construed as formal legal advice. It is not. It is general information and knowledge that they are providing to assist in your understanding of these processes. With that, I will just give a brief introduction of each of our discussants today. You were given their bios. I don't like reading through bios. You can do that yourselves, but I just want to, again, thank them for being here. The first is Amelia Schmidt, who's of counsel at Kaiser Dillon. And Ms. Schmidt has done a lot of white-collar criminal defense, understands the nuances and complexities of all kinds of litigation in white-collar criminal activities, and has been rated as one of the best lawyers in America in this field. And then we have Andrea Al-Attar, who is formerly did licensing work with the Office of Finance, in OFAC. And I want to add a bit of an extra disclaimer here. Her comments are general, and her PowerPoint presentation will be available. But again, it's purely general knowledge and information that she is providing today, and should no way be construed as related to or coming from the federal government or OFAC itself. Finally, we have Sarah Dada, who is a Deputy General Counsel with International Medical Corps, and has probably been in your shoes in dealing with actually trying to apply for and obtaining these licenses to operate. So I'm going to stop there because, as I said, we have a lot to cover in an hour, and we will be going through a number of topics. I'm going to do my very best to moderate questions that have come in prior to this webinar, as well as ones that you can enter through the Q&A function as we go. I'm going to apologize in advance because it's unlikely we will be able to get to every single question today. But as I said, this webinar is being recorded. The resources will be made available. And so if you don't get your specific question answered today, we will do our best to follow up with you, and you should contact us as needed. Without further ado, I'm going to leave it to our panelists, and again, thank them for being here. Take it away.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Kay, for hosting us today and for that nice introduction. Zach, if you could advance to the next slide. So just a quick disclaimer that the views in this presentation are those of myself and don't purport to reflect the official policy or views of the Department of Treasury or the US government. Next slide. Next slide. And next slide. We thought we would start out today with just a brief overview of OFAC's jurisdiction. The US Department of the Treasury Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, is responsible for administering and enforcing US economic and trade sanctions based on US foreign policy and national security goals against targeted foreign countries and regimes, terrorists, international narcotics traffickers, those engaged in activities related to the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and other threats to the national security, foreign policy, or economy of the United States. OFAC currently administers 34 sanctions programs, and the complete list can be found on OFAC's website. Comprehensive sanctions programs include the Crimea region of Ukraine, Cuba, Iran, North Korea, and Syria, and other programs, although not comprehensive, are significant in scope, such as the Venezuela-related sanctions. In addition, OFAC's sanctions list search tool, which I've provided a link to, allows searches to be conducted against all of OFAC's sanctions list. Next slide. The following must comply with US primary sanctions administered by OFAC. Activities by US persons wherever they are located in the world, activities by US owned or controlled foreign entities in certain programs, activities by persons in the United States, and transactions occurring from or routed through the United States. And some examples of potential touch points to US jurisdiction are listed there on the slide. There are also US secondary sanctions, which we will not discuss today in this presentation. Those apply to non-US persons for activities conducted outside the United States that the United States has targeted as posing as a threat to the economy, national security, or foreign policy of the United States. Next slide. I've listed here some questions for you to think through as you're assessing what applicable EAR and OFAC licensing requirements could be. I won't go through all of them. I'll just note a few. Does a transaction involve a party listed on BIS's entity list or on one of OFAC's sanctions lists, such as the list of specially designated nationals and blocked persons? Does a transaction involve a blocked person? Does a transaction involve an item on the Commerce Control List or that is subject to the EAR? What is the proposed end use for the item? What are some US touch points involved in the transaction? For example, US financing, insurance, services, infrastructure, and personnel. And is there a regulation assigning jurisdiction to a particular agency? Next slide. And listed here are two examples of regulations where jurisdiction is assigned to a particular agency. Next slide. I will now hand it over to Amelia to cover the process.
Thanks, Andrea. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes about the sanctions licensing process at the Bureau of Industry and Security, which is part of the Department of Commerce. Next slide, please. So what is BIS's jurisdiction? Taking a step back, the US government generally regulates exports, re-exports, or transfers of items, technology, and services. So what does that mean? I won't go into the weeds of how each of these terms are defined, but generally, just so people understand, re-exports mean, re-exports refers to sending an item that's been exported from the United States to another country outside the United States. And transfer very generally refers to a transfer of something that's been exported out of the US within a country that's outside the US. So where does BIS come in? BIS regulates commercial and dual use exports. Dual use meaning exports that either have a military or commercial end use. BIS administers the Export Administration Regulations, also called the EAR, to do that, to regulate commercial and dual use exports. Next slide, please. So as Andrea touched on, there are a lot of other agencies that, that can also regulate exports. One of them, which we're obviously talking about today, is OFAC. There's also the State Department, which regulates military exports. Trying to figure out whether your item is military versus commercial or dual use is an interesting question, but we won't get into the weeds with that today. And I've listed out a couple of the other U.S. government agencies that regulate very specific categories of exports. But BIS, again, by and large, is responsible and has jurisdiction to regulate any item that's going out of the United States, any kind of technology or data that's U.S. origin that's being sent out of the United States, and anything that basically anything that's going out of the United States or that is U.S. origin, which is another discussion we won't get in the weeds into today. BIS regulates it. Next slide, please. So, and this is just quoting the language directly from the EAR that acknowledges that sometimes, just because BIS has jurisdiction over one item doesn't mean that you are only obligated to figure out whether you need a license under the BIS under the BIS rules. You also have to figure out whether you need a separate license from OFAC. And there's a lot of, that's just an example, but there is, that's usually, I think, where you see people running into issues is if you have something that is, if you're trying to export something that is subject to BIS rules to the EAR, but you also have to ask yourself, well, wait, do OFAC sanctions apply? Do I need a license from OFAC? And that's the question. And once that most companies, and I suspect many of you are dealing with, and it's, it can be complicated. And so I sort of put a picture of an illustration from Alice in Wonderland, because I understand it can feel like that, where you feel like you're the one sitting at the table and a bunch of people are talking around you and telling you things you don't understand. So next slide, please. So again, BIS regulates commercial and dual use exports. I won't go through this line by line in the interest of time. So, you have to ask yourself, first of all, is what you're sending an export. And I went over this already just very briefly, what these different terms mean. But basically, all of these types of things are subject to the jurisdiction of BIS under the EAR. Next slide, please. Okay, so once you've figured out whether what you're sending out of the country is an export, you have to ask yourself, does my export need a license from BIS? And to do that, you ask yourself 4 questions. How is it classified under the EAR? Where is it going? Where am I sending it to? Who will have access to it? And how will it be used? Next slide, please. So you ask yourself, how is it classified? And this can be a very complicated question. And again, I won't get into this line by line, but basically you have to figure out what your export control classification number is. And then figure out, whether or not the export requires a license based on that. Next slide, please. Where's it going? And again, I've cited the regs here where you can go and figure out whether or not BIS is going to require you to get an export based on what the ECCN is and based on where you're sending it to and to whom you're sending it. Next slide, please. Again, who will have access to it? Anyone who is not a US citizen or not a permanent resident generally is considered a foreign person under the regs, and you need to figure out whether that's someone that's specifically regulated under BIS. And so Andrea's already laid out, I think, some of the lists under OFAC. She also touched on the entity list. I've provided some references here to where you can go to find out more about that. Next slide, please. How will it be used? Again, I've laid out the different reasons that BIS can decide that specific kinds of exports need a license, and whether or not specific end users need licenses based on how you're planning to use it. It's, again, I hate to keep saying it's complicated, but it is. But as a I've laid out, I think, the 4 questions you need to ask yourself, and then which part of the EAR you need to go to try to get answers to those questions and figure out if you need a license under the EAR to export it. Next slide. And there may be exceptions, which I believe Sarah is going to talk about briefly too. Common exceptions can include exports of humanitarian items, if you are exporting just replacement parts or equipment, or whether you're exporting something called consumer communications devices. But again, these exceptions can be interpreted in different ways. They don't always, they can apply in very different circumstances, to different countries, to different end users, and you have to be careful about evaluating whether an exception applies. And with that, a very high level overview, I will turn it over to Sarah to talk about what this process is actually like in her experience.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today. I'm going to go through some considerations for determining whether you need a license under OFAC and then under BIS. Next slide. So under OFAC, the first practical tip I have here is really know the law. And that's a really basic consideration. But the reason I say it is because often when sanctions are issued by the US government, they're done so in a piecemeal way. Often the regulations or the executive order is issued, and then some general licenses are issued, guidance is issued, FAQs are issued, sometimes even a specific license may be issued to you under a grant that you have. And so what I really think about when I am deciding whether I need a license is based on all of that guidance, kind of a comprehensive package of that, do we have the authorization to proceed with that transaction or not? These authorizations and the regulations can be found all kind of collated on the OFAC website under the country that you are considering getting a license for. And so you'll want to go through that page specific to that country very carefully and ensuring that you have a comprehensive view as to what the sanctions are and what your authorizations are. The regulations around this are not quite as straightforward as just reading a statute, and so that's why I bring this up. I also bring it up because applying for a license is time intensive and resource intensive, and it's not just on the legal department at your organization, but it really is a department cross-departmental effort to ensure that you have all the information you need, and so you really don't want to apply for a license if you don't need one. So the second step is to explore whether you may already have a specific license. Again, this is pretty basic, but I say it because sometimes these things are siloed within organizations. A specific instance of having a specific license where maybe you didn't apply for it on your own is under US government awards. In certain US government awards where you are operating in a jurisdiction where there are significant sanctions, or you're operating in a jurisdiction that is controlled by a designated terrorist organization or a sanctioned government, the US government may attach a specific license that they have applied for on behalf of your organization. So you should check to see if that is the case. As I mentioned, you'll also want to check whether OFAC has issued guidance separate from the general licenses and the regulations or executive orders. Some examples of those guidance documents that may be helpful for this group is a COVID-specific humanitarian guidance document that OFAC issued earlier this year. It doesn't really say anything more than what the regulations and general licenses are that are applicable to humanitarian organizations on a country by country basis, but it is a nice kind of collated guidance document that may be helpful to you. Another example is the humanitarian guidance that OFAC issued for Venezuela last year in August. Finally, you also want to consider whether you can obtain guidance short of filing for a license. So this may be in instances where it's a matter of interpretation and not necessarily a matter of your transaction was kind of clearly and deliberately excluded from whatever authorizations are already in place. So if it is a matter of interpretation, you may want to consider contacting the OFAC hotline. I know people have kind of had hit or miss experiences with whether OFAC actually responds to the OFAC hotline, but I do think it's worth a shot. And it's even better, I think, if a certain transaction or a certain activity that is otherwise potentially prohibited is something that is facing multiple NGOs. So if you can work collectively with other organizations on an issue and potentially bring that to a government entity like OFAC to say, we are all facing this, could you issue maybe informal guidance, formal guidance, an FAQ, a general license to address this issue? That may be another instance where you could get something short of actually obtaining a specific license that is specific to only your entity. And then finally, you're going to want to consider whether to use outside counsel. Outside counsel can be very, very useful, especially given the complexity of some of these sanctions programs and the variety of ways in which OFAC issues its guidance and exemptions. So outside counsel, will have expertise. They've also figured out the best ways to draft license applications or requests to OFAC. And so we'll be able to formulate those requests in specific and the most persuasive manner possible. Next slide. So just quickly on BIS, again, it's time intensive and resource intensive to apply for licenses for BIS as well. And with BIS, it's even more kind of cross-departmental because you are probably going to be coordinating not only kind of with legal and programs, but also with logistics, with IT. So you really wanna ensure that you understand whether you do need a license. So some considerations there are, do you need to procure items that are subject to the EAR, or are there kind of equivalent items available to the teams that are not subject to the EAR and not subject to BIS jurisdiction? You'll also want to see whether you can utilize any license exceptions. So Amelia already touched on that a little bit, but there are multiple licenses that are available. The license applicability is different from item to item and from country to country. So that again is going to need to be a specific evaluation of the context in which you're working. You'll also want to figure out whether BIS has issued any country-specific guidance or regulations that you can utilize. And then again, you'll want to consider whether to use outside counsel or in-house resources in order to submit an application to BIS or to analyze all of the regulations that we're talking about today. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Andrea to speak about applying for a license.
Great, and if I may interrupt for just a moment, thank you all. So we're moving into part of the agenda now about actually applying for a license. Before we do, there was one question that came in I think is interesting, so I'm going to ask it. It's from Hassan. Is there a precedent for a worldwide temporary general license for certain humanitarian goods? And he raises the example of this 1918 Spanish flu pandemic or other epidemics that require global, not piecemeal solutions. Could be interesting.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here. I know that there have been multiple efforts from a variety of organizations like Charity and Security Network, also Interaction and other groups, navigated at trying to bring to OFAC's attention the difficulties that NGOs face when implementing in areas that are subject to sanctions. In my interpretation of responses that we've gotten from government entities, especially OFAC, is that there doesn't seem to be an appetite for a worldwide general license. It does seem that the appetite is for very specific, narrow questions being presented to them for consideration of either issuing a general license, FAQ guidance, or a specific license. Kay has been part of those efforts too, so if I'm missing anything there, please let me know, or Amelia and Andrea, please jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add quickly, you know, I mean, I think that's also true on the BIS side generally, and this is just, you know, in my experience in interacting with both agencies, I think those are the kinds of issues that typically, you know, I think OFAC, BIS will maybe kind of look more to OFAC on what they're doing, because OFAC regulates. So, I mean, the regulations are so broad and open-ended. I think both agencies, you know, they work together, but that's just my experience that, you know, my sense would be that OFAC would be taking the lead on that kind of thing. But, you know, BIS is, since BIS regulates all commercial and dual-use exports, they would also be involved in any conversations about that as well. And I understand Kay may and CSN may also have been interacting with BIS, and she can jump in if there's anything I said that was wrong or unclear or incomplete.
Thanks. I think we're ready to move into the applying for a license portion. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. The reporting procedures and penalty regulations found at 31 CFR Part 501.800 outline OFAC's licensing authorities and procedures. Additional information specific to each individual program is available on the specific program's information page and in the program's implementing regulations. Just some terminology. A general license is a self-executing license contained within a program's regulations and or published on the program information page within OFAC's website. It's also referred to as a license by regulation or a web license, and it may be invoked by any person meeting the general license's terms and conditions. An important point, OFAC's policy is to not grant applications for specific licenses authorizing transactions to which the provisions of a general license are applicable. A specific license is a written document issued by OFAC to a particular person or entity authorizing a particular transaction in response to a written license application. So there's a written license application. The license would be issued to a particular person or entity authorizing a particular transaction in response to that application. And any person having an interest in a transaction or a proposed transaction may file an application for a specific license authorizing such a transaction. Next slide. Exempt transactions are transactions that are not prohibited by US sanctions as defined by regulations for the particular sanctions programs. And it's important to always check that the exemptions are available under all sanctions programs that may be implicated by your proposed transaction. So look to the specific regulations for each program. I've listed out some examples of exemptions: personal communications, humanitarian donations, information and informational materials, transactions ordinarily incident to travel to or from any country, and transactions for the official business by employees, grantees, or contractors thereof. And there's additional information on the slide about these exemptions. Next slide, please. OFAC has 2 online license application portals. I've listed here the online application portal for applications submitted under the Trade Sanctions Reform and Export Enhancement Act of 2000, TSRA. These are applications for exports and re-exports of agricultural commodities, medicine, and medical devices to Iran. There is a general license in the terrorism list government sanctions regulations for exports and re-exports of agricultural commodities, medicine, and medical devices to Sudan and the government of Sudan, as well as financing of such exports and re-exports, subject to conditions set forth therein. Some information to include in a TSRA application, which should be set out in a table format, is all information pertinent to the proposed transaction, including full names and addresses of all parties involved in the proposed transactions and their roles, including financial institutions and any Iranian broker, purchasing agent, end users, or other participants involved in the proposed export items. And if applicable, the commodity classification numbers that are associated with the proposed export items. Next slide, please. Here is the link for the online license application portal for other non-TSRA specific license applications. The information that should be specified in the online application is set forth in 31 CFR Part 501.801B2, as well as in the online application itself. You should include full names of all parties who are concerned with or interested in the proposed transaction. If filed by an agent, the full names of his or her principals, documentary attachments related to the proposed transactions. OFAC may also request such further information as is deemed necessary to assist OFAC in making a determination. And if the request is being made pursuant to the 2012 Statement of Licensing Policy on support of human rights, humanitarian, and democracy-related activities with respect to Iran, that should be indicated on the first page of the application. And later in the slides, they provide some information on that licensing policy, Statement of Licensing Policy. Additional information that is helpful to include is a discussion of any applicable Statement of Licensing Policy or articulation of a policy rationale supporting the request, overview of the applicable prohibitions, and suggested text for license authorization language, as well as any proposed terms and conditions. It's also helpful to include a fulsome description of the proposed transactions. And now I'll turn it back over to Amelia.
Thanks, Andrea. So if we go to slide 12. So for this, I'm just going to talk briefly about this, and I'm going to assume, for this portion of the presentation, I mean, let's assume that you've done the homework, you've looked at the regs, you've gone through all the steps Sarah described, and you've decided you do actually need a license. And I think once you've made that decision, a lot of the steps you have to go through, well, first of all, obviously the process is different. There's a different system for submitting it, SNAP-R, it's not the same as OFAC's. I've included a link there. There's a different system for tracking it. There's a link I've included there in the slide. And folks, you can contact if you have questions as you fill out the license application that I've included on the slide. Next slide, please. But I mean, really, I think a lot of the things Andrea's talked about also apply to rules of thumb you want to follow when you're preparing a license application for BIS. You need to figure out who you're sending it to, who's going to have access to it. You'll need to screen all parties to the transaction. There's actually a helpful tool that I've used. I believe clients of mine have used. It's publicly available. It's a link that just helps you search across screening lists. So BIS entity list, the unverified parties list, but also the different OFAC sanctions list that Andrea has talked about. You need to be specific about what you're sending out. You need to be specific about where, not just, if you're sending it to country X, but it's got to go through country Y and Z first, you need to specify that. You need to be specific about what the intended use is, and and as applicable, like what you intend to do. If there's a particular risk there of unauthorized access, you want to be sure you've specified what you're doing to make sure that the item or the technology is guarded. So next slide, please. I also include this slide here just because in practice, I've seen this happen sometimes. In the process of applying for a license, you may realize, oh, wait, shoot, there's this other transaction we should have gotten authorization for, we didn't. What's going to happen? If that happens, stay calm. But you need to vet it, investigate. Consider whether you need to prepare a voluntary disclosure. I've posted an actual link, not from BIS, but from the Justice Department that came out recently about voluntary disclosures. Next slide, please. And then I've provided some additional links to the BIS website that provide guidance on specific. There's one that's just the BIS has posted licensing guidance on a number of different topics. That's the first link. You can go there if you have specific questions about a particular topic, like encryption, Cuba sanctions, for example. There's also guidance on how to handle exports to individual foreign nationals. Like, for example, if you have an employee working for you who's not a U.S. citizen, and they're going to have access to potentially export controlled information, there's some guidance for getting a license to ensure that person can access it. There's also, and as Andrea talked about in the OFAC context, you do have the option to seek an advisory opinion from BIS on some of these issues. So again, I think there are a lot of similarities between OFAC and BIS in terms of processes, but I think, more than anything else, I want to stress that, when you're preparing a license, like the due diligence that you need to perform and the level of detail that you need to put in the license for BIS, I think everything Andrea said about OFAC also applies to what you want to be thinking about when you're preparing a license application for BIS. So I think with that, I will hand it over to Sarah to talk about specific tips.
Great, and we got a question in the chat box. It says, most counterterrorism EOs have canceled the humanitarian exemption in IEEPA. Is this common in other sanctions programs?
Oh, yes, thank you, Sarah. And Sarah, you may have thoughts on this as well. So again, the question was, most counterterrorism EOs executive orders have canceled the humanitarian exemption in IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. I hope if that acronym is not correct, I apologize. But is this common in other sanctions programs? Yeah, I mean, that goes to, I think that goes to OFAC, not BIS. But there's obviously, yeah, I mean, that BIS still has, you know, a license for humanitarian exports, but, you know, if OFAC is modifying its sanctions programs based on what's coming out in counterterrorism EOs, you may also see, you know, amendments to the EAR to reflect that or impose like additional limitations on the humanitarian exception. I'm not sure if that answers the question or not, but that from the BIS perspective, that's my take. And for as to other sanctions programs, I mean, I think you would want to go, you would want to check out the individual sanctions program page on OFAC's website if you're wondering about a particular sanctions program.
Great, thank you. And I agree. I mean, I have to say that the last major sanctions program that was really kind of put up was Venezuela, and that did include humanitarian licenses and a humanitarian guidance that was issued with it. So I don't think I have necessarily seen that correlation, although I don't know, and I have not seen OFAC kind of take back any of the humanitarian licenses or exemptions that they've issued on other programs. So maybe that's where they're going, but I have not necessarily seen that. Okay, so I'm going to transition to tips for navigating the OFAC and BIS licensing processes. Amelia, as Amelia mentioned, the actual license process and putting together the information is pretty similar, other than under the BIS licensing process, you're going to want to be submitting kind of items in a list with their ECCNs, their item specifications, potentially invoices or other information showing the cost of those. So that's kind of the technical side to the BIS application. Otherwise, when you're applying for an OFAC and BIS license, you are also going to be submitting kind of a narrative request alongside. So the first practical tip that I have is apply early. I cannot emphasize that enough. We've seen licensing processes take upward of a year on the OFAC end, and we have in some instances seen BIS licenses take upward of 6 months. This does seem to correlate to the type of sanctions program or which sanctions program you're applying for the licenses under. It does seem like under the Syria program that there is quite a bit of interagency communication, as I'm sure it is under other sanctions programs as well, but I have seen kind of those licensing processes for Syria take the longest. You should also communicate that to your country teams or the other teams that are relying on these licenses. There is, I'm sure, across all organizations, frustration oftentimes from field teams because they're like, the US government should know how to process these things quickly. They should know how to get these things to us quickly. Don't they understand the humanitarian imperative, the work that we're doing? And while, you know, we can present all of that in our license applications, it does not always go quickly. That review does not always go quickly. If you do need an expedited review, if you do need, you have a timeline or a deadline or any other sort of urgencies, I would put that at the top of the application. And then once a licensing officer is assigned to the application, I would follow up and emphasize that. At least from what OFAC has said in some of their public-facing talks, including the symposium last year, is that they do pay attention to those things, and especially where there is security, safety, or life kind of at risk, they do have processes for trying to expedite. Second, I would say decide whether to self-apply or apply through outside counsel. This is up to the organization, and I've seen it done both ways. And so you're going to want to consider kind of the complexities of the application that you're submitting, whether you have the in-house resources and expertise, or whether you have the resources to really field this out to outside counsel. Outside counsel, given their expertise, can often kind of catch pitfalls of organizations, or ensuring that the description of your activities in country itself does not violate sanctions. And so I do think that there's a real use for utilizing outside counsel for some of these applications. You're going to also want to work very closely with your country teams to gather all relevant facts and ensure that what is being submitted to the government is absolutely accurate. In that sense, you may also want to run the application by your country teams right before it's submitted as well, because of course our country contexts are always changing. We edit things and it may not reflect what's happening on the ground. So just ensuring that everything in there is accurate. And both Andrea and Amelia have provided a really good overview of the type of information that you're going to want to include. In terms of structuring the application and the information you're going to want to collect, I suggest having a section on a description of your organization, the humanitarian activities that you conduct, country-specific mission information about what you're doing in the country in which you're applying for the license for, background on the country humanitarian context. All of that information is sometimes helpful to set up the license application so that the officer knows kind of the impact of receiving that license or the impact of not receiving that license. You may also want to include a policy statement as to why, based on everything that OFAC or BIS has issued, why it seems appropriate under those structures to, in fact, have a license issued to you for the transaction that you're applying for. And again, that's a place where expertise of outside counsel can come in handy. Next slide, please. Thank you. So these are it's a list of some of the details that you're going to want to collect. Of course, a lot of, the applications are in narrative form, so you'll want to include some of these things in there. But sometimes things that could be forgotten is, for example, if you're applying for a license for a BIS license to transport items to Syria, you're going to want to include every point of contact that those items will go through, who's going to be handling them, transfer of control. And another thing to consider that sometimes is not paid attention to is the flow of funds and financial institutions. So be sure to really think about that. And then finally, you may also want to include a description of the donors or the grants that you're operating under, and especially if you're operating under a US government grant where there's not a general license that a general or specific license that applies to your work. Attach supporting documentation as you think it'll be helpful. Include the licensing authorities under which you're applying, and include any time constraints, as I mentioned as well. So overall, you're really going to want to submit a detailed package, because when the licensing officer gets it, they will come back with questions. You will receive back and forth questions, but that takes time. And so in order to speed up the process and kind of have a favorable application, including all of this right off the bat is very helpful. Great, so I will turn it over to Andrea on licensing policy and procedure.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. Okay, thank you, Zach. I will just quickly touch on some of these points, as I think some of them have already been covered, but some additional helpful tips for navigating the process are to identify in the summary of the application request any upcoming deadlines you have. So expiration of an existing license, a contractual deadline, or event date. Clearly mark whether the application is an initial application request, a reconsideration request, renewal or amendment of existing license, and avoid submitting multiple requests within one application. Instead, submit a separate application for each request. For example, separate a license renewal request from a request for a license for a new project. identify all sanctions programs that are implicated by the proposed request, provide all relevant documentary attachments, and electronic submission of the application is strongly encouraged. Next slide, please. And then this has already been touched on, but a detailed, carefully crafted description of the proposed transactions will facilitate review of your license application. So identifying all parties, their roles, their relationship to other parties, describing the services, goods, technology, and software to be provided, identifying key contractual terms as well as dates and timing, and describing any flow of funds, including names of financial institutions involved. And there's some additional information on this slide that, for reasons of time, I'll go into, but you can read through it when you have a moment. And I will turn it back over now to Amelia.
I think we're at slide 16, or actually 15. Okay. We covered this slide actually, so apologies, we can move on to the next one. And I don't have much more to add from the BIS perspective beyond what I think folks have already said. I put in another Alice in Wonderland photo or picture because, I do think sometimes at the outset, it's like, this is the picture of her trying to play croquet with a flamingo and a hedgehog. And I think sometimes that's what this process also can feel like. You start thinking, oh, I know what I'm doing. I know this game, or I can learn it. And then they give you, but then you're handed with tools that you have to figure out how to use, and it just gets confusing. So anyway, BIS licensing processing. BIS, as Sarah says, delay is common. Oftentimes BIS is using some of that time to consult with other agencies if they think other agencies have jurisdiction, especially OFAC. That's often one reason for delay, but there can be others, and so you just have to follow up diligently. I'm not sure if we've talked at any point yet on either the OFAC or BIS side about reaching out to the Chief Counsel's office. Sometimes you can do that. Sometimes it's an option, but I think you want to start at least with the licensing officer before trying to escalate things or get others involved. You can appeal if a license is denied. There's a site in the EAR that describes that process. But most importantly, while the license application is pending, don't proceed with the transactions that you've applied for. That is, if that becomes a real issue, if later the agency learns that you went ahead and proceeded with the transaction while the application was pending, that is against it's against BIS's regulations. It's against OFAC's. Although Andrea, correct me if I'm wrong about that, but that's probably the most important thing, piece of advice I can give on that process. I think with that, Sarah, I'll turn it over to Sarah to talk about any tips if she has anything else to add.
No, nothing to add here. I think that Andrea will have slides on following application submission, what to do after that.
Thank you, Amelia and Sarah. So we can go and skip ahead to slide 23. I've included here my statement of licensing policy procedure and OFAC guidance. That might be helpful as you work through the process, but in the interest of time, we won't go into those in detail. Some steps on following up after application submission. Each application receives a case number once it has been assigned, and there's an automated license application status hotline. I provide the number here to follow up on the status of an application. A licensing officer supervised by a section chief will be assigned to review your application. Typical additional steps in the review process: interagency review, coordination with the U.S. Department of State and other U.S. government agencies, such as the U.S. Department of Commerce as appropriate, legal review by the Office of Chief Counsel for OFAC as appropriate, internal OFAC review, application goes through appropriate management and supervisory review chains. OFAC generally does not disclose where an application is in the review process, although the licensing officer may note that an application is in interagency review. Again, I note the license application status hotline number for following up on status, and you can also email the licensing officer assigned to the case for a status update. Next slide. So in the event a license is issued by OFAC, it's helpful to review the terms and conditions. So the scope of the authorization, does it cover all parties and their role in the proposed transactions, all applicable sanctions prohibitions, all aspects of the proposed transactions, and the expiration date. You also want to check that and calendar this so you can request renewal of the license well in advance of its expiration. You also want to note any conditions or limitations to the license, as well as any reporting requirements, which may be set forth in a general or specific license. And there are consequences. I note the provision here for failing to submit reports. There are also record-keeping requirements you want to be mindful of. Next slide, please. And I won't go into these in detail given time, but in general, records shall be available for examination for at least 5 years after the date of the transaction. And there is a broad definition of records, which I provide here on the slide. And funds transfers that are routed through the U.S. financial system should include the relevant OFAC general or specific license, authorizing the payment to avoid the blocking or rejection of the transfer. And I will turn it back over now to Amelia to see if you have anything to add. If not, I can go back into OFAC license renewals and amendments.
All right, I'm unmuted. Just to say, I really don't have much more to add, and I know we're running short on time. I mean, the same rules apply to BIS licenses at a very, at a very high level, even though, again, we're dealing with different regulations. Like, you want to be careful about reviewing terms and conditions and make sure that you're applying for renewals in a timely manner.
One thing I'll add there from an NGO perspective is just make sure to train the individuals utilizing the license as to the scope and those terms and conditions, and have follow-up trainings or follow-up regularly scheduled calls to ensure compliance.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you, Sarah and Amelia. Next slide. And I've also included here a provision in the Iranian transactions and sanctions regulation regarding transactions ordinarily incident to a licensed transaction. They may also be authorized. And there is additional detail on this slide on that. Next slide, please. License renewals and license amendments. Again, just very quickly given time, you want to specify whether you're applying for a license renewal, which is a request to extend validity of a license on the same terms and conditions, or a license amendment, a request to change the existing terms and conditions of a license. Allow sufficient time for the request to be processed, address any potential changes in policy or law in your application, and consider whether any new proposed activities could be addressed in a separate license application. Next slide. And there is a provision for reconsideration of denials. The applicant or any other party in interest may at any time request by written correspondence reconsideration of the denial of an application on the basis of new facts or changed circumstances. Next slide. And I've included here some cautionary points and also some slides with enforcement cases and tips for interacting with OFAC, which I'll leave for you to review when you have a moment, but I will turn it back over to Amelia given time.
Thanks, Andrea. Yeah, and again, just to repeat what I've said, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on it because I know we're short on time. If you could go to actually the slide before, please. Great, thanks. And I think I've already said some of these things. If you need to make changes, BIS actually has a helpful list of changes that are not material and don't require a a license or don't require an amended license or any kind of approval from BIS to just make those changes. So I've included that there. And I really can't stress enough, what Sarah said about, making sure that your employees are trained, and also that you have written policies and procedures in place. So there's a resource for employees to go to if they have questions, and then of course, to follow up and to make sure that someone in the organization is identified, that if an employee has questions, they can follow up with that person. And that they know who that person is. There's also record-keeping requirements in place. I don't need to go into those. It's just generally a 5-year retention period for retaining BIS licenses. And then if you want to go to the last slide, please. I've also listed enforcement actions by BIS, just similarly to what Andrea put together for OFAC, that are related to failures to screen and engaging in export transactions, while the applications to get authorization for the transactions were still pending. But I won't go into the details of that. The links are there for your reference. And I believe that's all I have. So I think unless I'm cutting off Andrea or Sarah, and please, if you have other things to jump in with, please do. But otherwise, we could open up for questions if people have them.
Yeah, this is Paul. I want to thank everybody. I know we had to truncate some things toward the end there. We just have a few minutes left before the hour. We're doing our best to manage questions as they come in. There was one that came in about whether OFAC provides public information on licenses issues, and if not, why not? If someone wants to take that. The other thing I don't think we got to, or if someone wants to offer cautionary tales, often real life examples are the most illustrative. And I don't know, perhaps Sarah, someone from the application side has one, or any of the three. I'll see if you have anything to offer on that front.
Amelia,
Go ahead, Sarah.
I don't actually know the answer to the first question of, does OFAC provide public information on the specific licenses it issues, and if not, why not? I have not seen just kind of generally published information about specific licenses issued, but I very well may be missing something on that.
I haven't. Oh, go ahead, Sarah.
No, have you seen that?
I have not seen that. Andrea, if you have slides that you think answer that question, feel free to jump in, but I haven't seen that.
Specific licenses are not published on the OFAC website. I can't speak to OFAC policy on that.
Great.
Two more questions that came in. One is really interesting, actually, whether the OFAC license application timing has been affected by COVID-19. And then there's a more specific question related to BIS. I'm going to just read this because it's fairly detailed. If an international NGO staff member has or is traveling into a country as part of his or her role with an INGO, however, the BIS license is required for that country, would she or he be personally held liable for carrying IT equipment or software? And in relation to that above scenario, would nationality make a difference for the individual?
Sure. I mean, I can take the BIS question. It's my understanding that COVID may be affecting the OFAC license processing time, but Sarah may have more to say about that. On the question about BIS, I mean, as a general matter, U.S. companies can be liable for BIS violations or the EAR violations on behalf of their employees or their agents. I'd also say that, and I should say that individuals, themselves can also be liable personally. They can be subject to civil or even criminal liability, but that doesn't necessarily let the employer off the hook either. If the employee, on the nationality, if the employee or the agent is not a U.S. citizen and instead is a citizen of another country, the companies generally need to keep in mind that providing that employer agent with software technology is what's called a deemed export. I don't think I've used that term yet on this presentation, but it's considered a deemed export. And so you need to review the EAR and consult with inside or outside counsel on getting on an employer agent's access to that, and also onto the general question about bringing export control, having an employee take export controlled items or information abroad.
Yeah.
Well,
Whether
go ahead, Sarah.
there's impacting licensing timing, it's unclear. It may have at the beginning, but the timeline for licenses kind of varies across programs and what you're asking for and officers. So it's really hard to tell from an external perspective. Great.
Well, this is the part of my job as moderator I really don't like, because this has been an extremely rich discussion, and more questions were coming in. I hope for those participants that asked questions that we got to them, that you got answers. But as I said, there will be resources. This has been recorded. We will make the slides available. And if there are questions you have, Charity and Security Network is more than happy to help facilitate information sharing and guidance and so on. Please join me in thanking virtually Andrea and Sarah and Amelia. Thank you so much for your time and your wisdom. And thank all of the participants for their good work. And please, everyone, have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul.